Hello, everybody. It's been a while. I've been pretty busy with work out in Wyoming and Montana the last couple months. I just recently returned to New Hampshire, and I wanted to get out some videos. While I was out there, although I was quite busy, I was able to do quite a bit of reading. So there's a couple books that I want to talk about. Before I get to that, a little housekeeping. I am going to go to the UK this month, the last week of August, and then the week before that, I'll be in Iceland. I mention that just because I have quite a few subscribers in the UK, so if there are any of you who see this, who live in the UK or someplace else in Europe, and you'd like to say hi or maybe possibly meet up, let me know. I'm going to be in London pretty much the entire time, barring short day trips, but I think I'm going to pretty much stay focused there. I already have all my arrangements set up and where I'm staying and all that, but it would be cool to get to meet some of you guys if you are interested. So just shoot me a PM or put a comment or whatever. But I normally don't want to do that in a video that's about another topic, but I don't think all of you will watch a video that's just an update video, so I'll put it here. So that's that, 1 minute in. So the first book I want to talk about is the second in a so far trilogy, although it may become longer than that, by Deirdre McClosky. Uh, all of these books have in the title Bourgeoisie. So the first one is called Bourgeoisie Dignity, and I did a review on that, I think 3 or 4 years ago. It's been quite a while since I read it. And I've had this one for quite a while. And I must say that I really loved Bourgeoisie Dignity. It was very iconoclastic. It's a very thorough coverage of the Industrial Revolution and the reasons why it didn't start, which sounds like it wouldn't be that revealing, but she goes into, the various purported causes of that event and breaks them down on why they don't work, and in the process isolates what might the actual causes be. And then this is the second book, Bourgeois Virtues. Here we go. Ethics for an Age of Commerce. And this third one, which I have but have not started yet, is called Bourgeoisie Equality. So what's interesting is, as much as I loved that book, as much as I found it thought-provoking and interesting and worthy of reading, it wasn't that fun to read. It was not a real page turner. There's something about McClosky's writing style that doesn't, I don't want to say it's not unengaging, but it just aggravates me a little bit. She writes kind of the way that she speaks. And if you ever listen to her speak, she's a trans woman. She started as a man. So her voice is really bizarre. It sounds like it's being morphed actually somehow. But she talks like a grandma. She's almost, there's a certain kind of gentle, patronizing tone to the way that she speaks. She's very, very, very smart. She's very, very knowledgeable. She's very widely read. When you listen to her curriculum vitae, she's has degrees in all kinds of things. She's been professors in all kinds of things, um, and she has a tendency, not in a um, showy way per se or a egotistical way, but just uh, kind of like a grandmother would talk to a child, and she writes that way too, and it's not always the best. So I started reading this book, and when I realized what it was about, because I just assumed, well, this is going to be more analysis of the Industrial Revolution and further examining her thesis in that book, and it's really not. So in this book, she writes at the beginning that this book is not intended for people who agree with her already. This is not intended for libertarians. So I'm wondering if maybe that's one of the reasons that I didn't like the style. Although I will say I love this book and I think it's a good book, definitely worth reading. Sometimes the style is not my favorite, but she says this is a book for the clerisy, and the clerisy is the term she prefers to use for the educated urban elite, the people who are basically strongly skeptical or totally reject libertarianism or most parts of libertarianism. Uh, and of which she's a member. She's very much a member of the clerisy or the literati. And she's writing this book for them. And I have to wonder, like, how many of them are ever going to read this book. She's famous enough and published enough that she has an audience, but I think most of that audience is probably going to be free market oriented, libertarian type people. She first came to my attention, by the way, from a series of Gary North lectures a long time ago, probably 10 years ago or more, about her first book, Bourgeoisie Dignity. And his lecture was entirely derivative of her books, which he had readily admitted. I just find that interesting too, because Gary North probably stone her to death if he had his druthers, but he very much respected her books. So I don't know how many of the people in the clerisy are watching Mises Institute videos and then going and buying her book, but she's writing this for them. She's writing this as an attempt to argue for their benefit. And the argument she's trying to make here, and there's a couple interesting ones. One is against the claim that a capitalist society is a society that lacks virtue or that lacks culture. This is a very common theme that is attached to by the enemies of free markets and capitalism and libertarianism, that a society that's based on a market economy and voluntarism and free exchange is going to be one that is in some sense denuded of culture or Luddite or some other kind of demeaning moniker. And the point that she makes here is that, and I think it's a totally valid one, is that it's the complete opposite of that. To have the necessary resources, the surpluses, to indulge in people's higher wants, you have to have as productive an economy as possible. And the more productive it is, the more you can spend on things that you find interesting. And that's what we've seen. You know, if we go back 200 years, 300 years, the outlets that the average person had to express themselves artistically or culturally were quite limited. Not zero. I don't think you can ever go and say there was zero culture. But if 99 or 95 or 90% of your time must be allocated to producing food and shelter, or else you were starved, well, then that remainder, that marginal that's left, is not sufficient to patronize or to embellish or to develop extracurricular interests, right? Whereas if it only takes you 10% of your time to meet all of your caloric needs and your basic needs, and 90% of your time, and I'm not saying this is true with everyone, but then the amount that you can invest in other things, that if you want to try and become a painter or a musician or an actor, or if you want to go hiking or experience nature or become a surfer or do other studies, learn other things. You know, for instance, having a book collection like this, if you go back 200 years, 300 years, having hundreds or thousands of books would have been a sign of extreme wealth, would have been an indication of high status and something that people would, oh, wow, you have 100 books? You even have one book? I mean, if you go back far enough, that would have been, I mean, you might have and then you get, well, people could afford to have one book and it would be the Bible. And then if you had someone who had two books, it was like, wow, the Jenkins over there, they have two books. And now even people who are not bibliophiles like me have lots of books probably. And if they like books and if they like to read books, they can accumulate more than they can ever actually get around to reading, which is probably the predicament that I find myself in. And I'm certainly not alone in that. And that's just one element, you know. And the contrary, you know, the socialist system, the communist system, the democratic socialist system actually allows far less purview for you to do this. Your freedom of action, your freedom of expression is much reduced in a less free society. Then she goes on to talk about the idea that in a capitalist society that people don't have virtue, that people become avaristic or greedy would be probably the term most people use. And she lists here 7 virtues, and she goes through why these 7, why not more, why not less. And she does have these, there's some discrimination here between the 4 pagan virtues, so-called, which she calls courage, justice, temperance, and prudence. All right, so these are virtues that can be identified in the classics, in Greek and Roman writings and ideas, and even before. And then she adds the Christian virtues, hope, faith, and love. And there's chapters dedicated to each. And I have to say, like, when I realized that this was what the book was going to be about, I had hesitancy about continuing to read it. I thought, well, do I really need to know this? Do I really care? Is this really that interesting? And the answer is that it is, actually. that virtues are important, and she goes into why they're important and why you need to have more than one. There's a certain myopia. Let's say courage, for instance. If you only had courage, and that was your only virtue, and everything you did was courageous, you would be you would be a murderer. You would be a horrible, violent misanthrope. Um, Whereas if you had only faith, you would just do nothing. You would become a complete vegetable because you would just have faith that whatever would happen and you would do nothing, right? And so, and she talks about Aristotle basically writing to this effect that every choice you make will be swayed by these virtues. And he didn't have the exact list of 7, but there's more than one positive impulse, right? There's not only one truth all the time and then it's laser beam, you always go that direction. There's considerations for this and for this, and when you make a decision on how to act, it takes that into account, or it should anyway. Also very evident here that she's quite obviously a Christian. She's an Episcopalian, and a little proselytizing about it actually in parts of this book. Which is quite refreshing from somebody from the literati, somebody from this subgroup of the population where being an atheist is the trendy thing to do. So I found that refreshing, even if I didn't necessarily agree with it, all of it. It's almost like the cool thing to do now would be to be religious, because being atheist has been so cool for so long. So there's that. But then the other virtue, I think the one that's the most interesting from a libertarian perspective, is her analysis of prudence. Prudence is a very important virtue. Prudence makes a lot possible, but prudence is not the only thing. And here she has a very biting critique of monetarist economics, and even all economics generally, except for the Austrian school. And her endorsement of the Austrian school is more or less explicit relative to all the other schools. She doesn't make it, there's not like a chapter called that. She doesn't just come out and directly say it, but it's directly implied by the things that she says. But the idea is prudence isn't the only thing that guides people. And so much, this is interesting because the opponents of free markets and of capitalism will, as a critique, say you're solely motivated by self-interest. You only care about self-interest, and that's they use that as a slur, as a slander. And what's hard about it is then you do have free market people. You do have economists, especially people like Milton Friedman, for instance, who to a large extent will say, yeah, prudence is enough. People acting in their self-interest is a sufficient motivation to arrive at a prosperous society. And her argument is that that's not true. Prudence is a virtue. Prudence is important, but there are other virtues that figure into this. Now, none of these virtues, for those of you who might be worried, imply that the government should run our lives, or that we should even have a government, period. She doesn't get into the anarchism debate, but it sounds very clear that she's at the very least a philosophical anarchist, if not a political one, although close, I would say. But that, it's completely false that people are completely ruled by prudence. People have other motivations that influence them. That seem altruistic ones. They believe in other things, they act accordingly. And I think this is a big problem with some of the models that are so popular. In order to come up with a model, it's necessary to reduce your variables, and so you just assume that people are purely self-interested. And so you have this public choice and the monetarists, and then they get confused when they have things like the prisoner's dilemma, and they assume, well, if you have two prisoners, they're going to rat out on each other. One of them is going to rat because that's the incentive. That's the prudent thing for them to do, right? The prudent thing is for one of them to rat out the other one. And there's lots of other similar tests to this where the self-interested thing to do would be to do X, and then people don't do X. They'll do Y or Z. And it's like, well, there's something wrong. What what they got wrong is they assumed Homo economicus, right? Homo economicus is the prudence only, the self-interested only economics man. And there is no such thing. Now, that might be useful in making a model, but then that model is based on not a human or humans, but on a construct, which might be hypothetically interesting or whatnot, but is not going to be that telling about the real world. And so she goes into quite a lot of critique on this idea of a prudence-only humanity or a prudence-only person. That people have other motivations, that they have other virtues, and that these are important. And that if you want to have a good life, that you should try and balance all 7 of them. You should be courageous, but not to the point that you're a bloodthirsty maniac. You should have faith, but not to the point where you become, a vegetable that you don't do anything. You should have temperance, right? You shouldn't do things to excess, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything at all, right? It might not be, you shouldn't be a drunk, but that doesn't necessarily mean you should never drink, although I never drink, but, and so on and so forth. And she makes a compelling argument as to why, and I actually found it quite a refreshing read. So, wow, this video is going to be very short. I'm going to do some others that might be a little bit longer here in a little bit, but yeah, this is definitely a worthwhile book. I would read Bourgeoisie Dignity first. That is more interesting in terms of economic history and economics generally, but this is more interesting philosophically, I would say. So again, Deirdre McClosky, Bourgeoisie Virtues, and I will let you know when I read the next one. I don't think it will be 3 years or 4 years like it was between these two, but there we go. All right, guys, I got plans. I have to plan out this vacation. Again, feel free to put comments or personal message if you live in the UK and you'd like to meet. I know I have quite a few subscribers there, so that'd be cool. And I will talk to all of you another day. Bye-bye.